The House is resumed. Before the dinner break, we were debating the Countering Terrorist Fighters legislation. The Honourable Michael Woodhouse has 7 minutes remaining, should he care to take that opportunity.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, the Labor Party has come to the decision that we will support this bill, at least as far as the Select Committee, on the basis that there are some things in the bill that we think are sensible and necessary, and also because, given that the government will have the numbers to pass this bill in, the Minister's offer to cooperate, we thought we would take advantage of that offer and we would see what we could do to improve the nature of the bill so that it was more broadly acceptable. I have to say, Minister, that the process has been pretty appalling. Not the process of your consultation with some opposition parties, that's fine, but what is appalling is that this bill is introduced tonight and it will pass through its final stages within a fortnight. Now, as long as I've been in this House, I've been opposed to the rushing through of legislation under urgency unless there are very good reasons for it. And the key question, Minister, and it's a genuine question that I'm going to put to you, is that the British, tomorrow, the United Kingdom Parliament is introducing very similar legislation to this, dealing with stopping people returning as terrorists, dealing with monitoring air passengers, preventing travel abroad. Our level of threat is considered low. What does low mean? Low means that it's possible but not likely. The British level of threat is much, much higher than that. I think it's at a high level, if not an extreme level. But the British House of Commons and the British government, in their wisdom, are taking this bill through its normal processes, and they hope to have it as part of their law in May 2015. Now, my question is a genuine question, Minister. Why is this so absolutely urgent that it needs to go through before Christmas, given that we have a low threat level, when the British passing similar, though somewhat more draconian legislation, are going through a full Select Committee process and will take 6 months to do what you're doing in 2 weeks? Now, I think that is a reasonable question to ask, and I want to say about this bill that whenever you deal with security intelligence legislation, it is a case of balance. It's a case of balancing our responsibility as a parliament to protect the safety and well-being of our people. I accept that as a responsibility, and that is why we are giving full consideration to this legislation. But the other rights that we have to protect are the rights of ordinary and innocent New Zealanders not to be subject to unnecessary invasion of privacy and not to have their fundamental rights, such as the right to travel, withdrawn. So all legislation of a security intelligence nature needs to balance these rights. I had to balance those rights when I put through the Terrorism Suppression Act in 2002, and that was in the wake of 9/11 and all of the trauma that came with that. I don't doubt that we need to watch closely what the organisation called ISIS is doing. I denounce that organisation unreservedly as being a brutal organisation that commits crimes against humanity and commits war crimes. And we do have, under the Security Council Resolution 2178, an international responsibility to do what we can to prevent New Zealanders to go to contribute to an organisation that is committing crimes against humanity. I have no problem with that. I believe that we are obliged to do that. But there are aspects of this legislation that I worry about. One aspect of the legislation is that we can withdraw passports when people are overseas, and I'm told that having a passport is not the equivalent of being a citizen. But the English plan, I think, is stupid. The English plan is to take away the passport and not to allow people to return. That's incredibly irresponsible. I know that is not the plan of this government. But, Minister, what I would point out to you is that I can't see anything in this legislation that legislates for the guarantee that we've been given by your officials that people who had their passports removed while they were overseas would have the absolute right to have travel documents to return to the country of their citizenship. Now, we may be able to repair that in the Select Committee, but it is a concern because, you know, what they've discovered in academic research on this, if you were to leave a person without a country to go to, then what are they going to do? They're going to go back to their terrorist mates and continue to do the awful things that we don't want them to do. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I want to say to the Minister that protecting our people against terrorism might be helped by this legislation, but mainly it is helped by two factors. One is that we do have good relationships between people and communities in this country. I have the largest Muslim community in New Zealand. I know them to be hard-working, law-abiding, decent people. What I don't want to see is legislation, either in its form or in the way that it's implemented, marginalising and alienating that group. I've dealt with a lot of immigration cases in my time, and I know that as soon as we start getting cases where people are denied the right to travel to a wedding or to a funeral because we might have some suspicion about them, that we're going to target some people who we shouldn't be targeting. And what I'd like to find out in the Select Committee process, short as it is how we prevent that happening. I know right now that the New Zealand government has the full cooperation of the leadership of the Muslim community. What I don't want to do is to lead them or other people in the community that aren't leaders to believe that they should withdraw that cooperation. I've met with the Muslim leaders, as has David Shearer. We met them together, and I want to make sure that they have a fair chance to have their voice heard so that they're part of the process and not seem to simply be a target of the process. So harmonious community relationships in New Zealand are vital to preventing a base in which, or support for any terrorist action. The second thing that is absolutely critical is not simply this legislation, but it's New Zealand's reputation for being relatively independent and principled in foreign affairs. And this legislation has to be seen alongside a decision to commit troops to Iraq. And my worry is we will pass this legislation, but actually by doing the wrong thing in the wrong way, we could well remove one of the major protections that actually keeps this country as a safe place to live in. Mr. Speaker, I also want to get the threat posed by terrorists in some proportion. It's really important to do that. Right now, I believe that most New Zealanders are more at threat from methamphetamine-crazed addicts like Anthony Dixon, who actually took a samurai sword and started slashing people about. The threat in my office is not that I'm worried that an Islamic terrorist will come up the stairs, but we deal constantly with people that have serious mental disorders. They're threatening, some of them have been imprisoned. So before we start going overboard with this foreign fighters terrorist threat, let's make sure that we see the threat in proportion. Mr. Speaker, the other thing that I really need to say is that I welcome the Minister's speech and introduction, and I welcomed his speech on the urgent debate, but I contrast his speech with that of Bill English, Stephen Joyce and Mr. Coleman, Jonathan Coleman. Because what worries me is that we get a very reasonable speech from the Minister saying security issues should be above politicking, on top of a debate where leading national ministers didn't have the decency to apologise for politicising the issue of the Security Intelligence Service, leaking material to whale oil to try to get an issue up based on inaccurate, mistaken and misleading information about me. That was repeated by those ministers over the last 3 years. Not one of them have apologised now that an official report from the Inspector General of Security and Intelligence have found out that I maintained my credibility and integrity, and it was the Director of the SIS that did not. So, Minister, by all means, we will offer you cooperation, but it can't be on the basis of a fear that I have that if this National Party does not own up to its faults in politicising the SIS and what Phil Dejew and Jason Eade in John Key's office did, how can I be confident that you're not going to politicise the SIS in the future? I'd like to believe what the Attorney-General is telling us, and I will try to believe that, but it is not reflected in the speeches that have been given by some of his senior colleagues in the House in the urgent debate this afternoon.
I call the member Mark Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd just like to say that we're looking forward to receiving this bill on the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee. I know that I'm committed to working with my colleagues across the House